Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one in our occasional series of chats with experts in AI from a range of different sectors and backgrounds and things like that. And in a world where there's a lot of experts and not as much expertise, we're always really honoured to hear the thoughts of people who are doing things that are genuinely making a difference, kind of really thinking about how AI will affect us all as we go through life in this kind of like new world. I don't know if you've heard the phrase like fourth industrial revolution, but there's a lot of hype going on at the moment. So talking to people who really know what's going on and understanding that is great. Today we're joined by Sarah Wyer, who's now shout out if I've got any of this wrong, who's currently coming to the close of a PhD and teaching and a teaching fellow at the Department for Computer Science at Durham. And really thinking about gender and social class bias in large language models. I think kind of what's really interesting and would love to hear more about is the approach that you're taking in terms of intersection and how that works. You've also got so many different other things and kind of like groups going on. We are incredibly grateful to have some time with you today. But also hang on, I had a list of them here. The Foundation for Computer Science and what have we got here? Data architect for the FDM group, professional development expert at Cornell, global ambassador for the Women Tech Network. You've been nominated for the Women in Tech Global Awards as a rising star in STEM and also a Women Tech Ambassador Award. And I'm sure there's multiple things that I've not got onto. So thank you very much for coming along today and speaking to us. And how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for that welcome. Just as a small thing, I was a teaching fellow at Durham University for quite some time, but I'm not now. I'm a professional development expert at Cornell, so that's kind of been a recent thing. But yeah, still teaching computer science, which is something that I love. Yeah, so that's the only thing I'd say. But yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Just on that, do you find your teaching practice helps inform your work in other areas, things like that?
Absolutely, and you know, being involved with students always helps, right? So you're always seeing ideas, you know, you're seeing these ideas crystallize before your eyes, and you're explaining these things that you thought you already knew anyway. And it's these developments that are coming along, and there's always new questions, especially at the minute, right? So always these new questions. You're like, actually, maybe I didn't see it from that point of view. And you know, sometimes if it's quite interesting if you've got a room full of males and you start talking about bias and things like that with artificial intelligence, they're like, is there bias? What about bias? But then when you speak to women and girls, often they'll just go, obviously it's bias. So it's like just that instant recognition of what's going on generally. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, that is. I love that. It's that sort of, I don't know if it's just the universe as well, but kind of just when you think you kind of got your head around it, often something else happens. Like we were doing, so we if we do training or consultancy, it tends to be like education, but in the business setting, like a B2B thing or something like that. And we often work with like leadership teams, and we do like a sort of workshop setting, and they kind of come in and they want to learn about AI. Well, they want to use AI for business, so it's very practical. But then they kind of go, we need to understand it to know how to use it. And you kind of run through this sort of kind of program. And every time it happens, it seems the week before something massive changes. And the first time it was DeepSeek came out and wiped $1 trillion off the stock exchange. The most recent one was the day before we were due to kind of deliver it. The Pope came out and spoke about it. And you're like, these are like just like you never got that with like IT consulting. Like the Pope never came out and critiqued Excel spreadsheets. This is a very different sort of stuff. So it's cool to see it in context, I think. Cool. We've already gone off track. This is brilliant.
Yeah. But yeah, so that kind of reminds me. I will because it is relevant. So I will mention it. It reminds me of my it reminds me of my PhD. So when I've been doing it part time and working full time, and when I started my PhD, it was like, what will I do it on? And I was speaking to a lot of people in the field, and somebody said, have you heard of this thing called transformers? It's really new. Don't know what it is. Obviously, now we know it's ChatGPT and DeepSeek and all of that stuff. And I was like, oh, I'll have a look, you know. And I just thought, that sounds interesting. I'll do bias in this area. Obviously, and every week since then, it's been on a roller coaster. So right from I've been there since the inception, all the way through trying to write a PhD about it. So yeah,
that is so cool. It's that once you finish this PhD, and should you wish to kind of be like super masochistic and do another one, you could do a PhD on the fact that how do PhDs work in the age of AI, when you can kind of start to produce big theses in different ways and everything's changing. And that is so cool. I think our kind of equivalent was, we used to go into, you know, kind of like showing people how technology works. And about a year and a half ago, people, up until then, people were going, oh, can it do that? And now the same question is asked, but they go, is that all it can do? And the perception, the expectation's just gone from, you know, it used to be that you would on average have 1 or 2 people for the Terminator and that sort of concept of evil AI. And now people are more likely to refer to that paperclip that Microsoft made in the 90s, you know, kind of that assistant, or Star Trek, which is always my further utopian sort of science fiction dystopian. But yeah, that was an interesting segue. I think we need to kind of keep hold of those, because that's some really interesting things going on. But you mentioned your PhD and you know, kind of the idea of bias, and I think a lot of people have got a sense that bias exists, like you're saying, kind of the extent to which it exists within the models, within the data. And I think there's a real, I mean, certainly we've been working with people who either public sector or working for large organizations, companies who want to do the right thing, genuinely really want to do the right thing, want to use this technology to get the efficiencies it brings, but they have a sense that bias is there looming like a big grey cloud on the horizon, and they want to do something about it, but they're not quite sure what it is. In terms of your work, I think there's just so much information for us to kind of dig into, but at the top level, how are you seeing, you know, how is it that gender and social class biases are manifesting within these models? And, you know, kind of like on the theoretical, technical side, that's one piece, but how are they then manifesting in the real world as well, or what are the consequences of that? Just be good to get a lay of the land to get our heads around what that means, really.
Yeah, so just on a basic, so I'll go back to the PhD. So similar to that conversation we were talking about, where I was thinking, oh, I've heard of this transformer thing. So it was GPT-2 at the time. And I had a look, and I was with my supervisor, Sue Black, and we were having a chat, and I said, I'll come back to you in a week and I'll see what bias I've found. And literally I was on a call, came off the call, and I typed in women are, and then men are, and that's all I typed in. So two different prompts. And back then we didn't even have prompts, so that I was calling them inputs. But yeah, so I typed those 2 things in, and it I won't say on a call, but everything that it said for women was highly sexualized. It was very, very sexualized. And then for men, it was all about men are leaders. And, you know, that took me 30 seconds to do. And that was a model that was released by OpenAI and available to everybody. So like that took seconds to look at. Yeah, so there's an example.
Yeah, that is absolutely stark. It's the kind of with a lot of the image stuff as well, you know, when kind of people are using to generate images and things, and you know, kind of that example of we do quite a lot, well, speak a lot to UK advertisers and people who were working in, you know, kind of like advertising agencies and stuff like that, and you know, they were like using this for kind of imagery for adverts or for print, not for print, you know, for web and stuff like that. But more often than not, if you were like powerful business leader, it would be a man versus a woman, and you know, just as kind of like a get-go and elements like that. When it kind of evolved, you know, kind of like the PhD and thinking it through, as it kind of evolved, so you've got that stark, almost instant, this is not as it should be, and it's so stark as well. How do you begin to approach that and untie that and work out what you want to do next in terms of research?
So from that point, so at that point, the book Invisible Women had just landed. So that was by Caroline Criado Perez. And if anyone hasn't read it, I strongly recommend that you do, because you should. Also, Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble also. So if you've not come across her work, she uncovered intersectional bias within Google itself. So she had, I think it was her nieces coming to visit. She's a woman of color, and she said, "What shall I do with young black girls this weekend?" Innocently typed that in, and she was just inundated with just terrible content, and that spurred her on to then put together some prompts, which I based my research on. So she put some in, she did some research and just found out that, shone the light on the fact that Google was massively, intersectionally racist, especially to women of color. So I read those two books, and I just thought, right, what I'll do is, it's very similar in concept, so I'll do that for women and men, and I modified her prompt scheme and just said women can, men can, just like I said there. Just did a few different iterations and just ran it through these models, thousands and thousands of times, and then did some analysis on it. And it was really interesting.
Yeah. So actually, what would be really useful for audiences from quite a different few different areas? What is intersectional bias? I think we kind of have a head. What is intersectional bias, and how does that? What's the impact? Does it like multiply things, or does it fragment things? And how does it break down?
So Kimberly Crenshaw is the person who coined the term, and she's done a lot of work on this. But it's where our identities overlap. So, for example, we're not just one identity, right? I'm not just a woman. I am a white woman. And if I was sat next to a woman of color, we would have different advantages, privileges, and we'd experience oppression in different ways. So it's not like a point, like some people think it's almost like you can allocate scores to these things. Can you? I don't know if you can, but it's certainly where these identities overlap and intersect, and where power and privilege can, a white generally. So this is the issue with tech right now, right? And we're seeing it play out, especially in the geopolitical space, especially in the States right now. So you've got predominantly white, elite educated men that are ruling the roost, and and that's filtering down, especially in technology, because it's very tech centered. And you can see that, right? And that's why we're getting all of this, in my view, getting all of this bias within these large language models, because we're essentially, when we're creating artificial intelligence, these systems, when we make choices, right? We make choices on the algorithms, we make choices on the data sets that we're using. So, for example, GPT, I'm going to talk about that again, because everybody knows about it, but GPT, they script the internet for data. And, we could all say, we could come back to that, but the data is full of just rotten stuff, in my view. But one of the places that they did look at, and I think 24% of the data that they scraped was from Reddit. And at that time, Reddit has changed its profile somewhat since then, but I'm not sure what it is exactly now. But back then, it wasn't. If you had a man and a woman sat together and they said, should we use Reddit? Maybe the guy would go, great idea. Maybe the woman would say, should we have a think about that? So it's these choices, our biases, our values, and our privilege or oppression. It gets baked into these systems.
Yeah, it's I think that Reddit stat is one that I think is particularly telling as well. It's so you can kind of imagine the scenario where it's we need a lot of words to train this thing. Where can we find a load of words? Oh, look, there's Reddit. We can kind of get hold of that. Shall we use that then? And people have gone, almost been judging it by the criteria of, are there lots of words to use to train a model there? Not what's the philosophical what's the philosophical biases of the people, or kind of like what is the bias of the information that you've got there? Like, is it appropriate? Is it inappropriate? And kind of what's going on. yeah, it's kind of not it's maybe unintentional when it first happens, but then there's a point where actually the consequences of it, you know, kind of are so great that the intention behind it is not as important, if that makes sense. It kind of feels that it's something, and as soon as it's highlighted, it should become, you know, does it then become intentional? I don't know. There's an ethical question there, isn't it?
It's really, really interesting that you say that, actually, because you know, we've touched on hype, haven't we? And, you know, in my view, AI, where we are right now, is massively overhyped. And it's interesting because obviously my PhD tracked OpenAI's kind of evolution as to where we are now. And when we were looking at GPT-2, you know, it was problematic and they weren't releasing the model. So they said this model, you know, hype came along and said, this hype is too dangerous to release. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It's too dangerous to release. 3 months later, released, you know. So it got attention. And, you know, they've been using that model ever since, in my opinion. So they've been just using that, you know, it gets attention. And, you know, I think Sam Altman is a very good businessman and hype maker, whatever. I could probably think of a better term than that. But yeah, he's very good at creating hype around a product. But whether it, I think
there's almost more facets to it than just the hype behind it. There's a lot, you know, kind of there's the kind of the integrity of it as a whole, I think is important. There's a phrase called design lock-in, which I think I first came across. There's a guy, I want to say Jared Lanier, who wrote a book called You Are Not a Gadget. And he was kind of like quite a tech, you know, kind of like a tech thinker, but a while ago, and I'm not entirely sure what kind of came of him after, but I remember reading this book, and within it, there was a paragraph about design lock-in and saying what it is. And it was described as when the first human is woken up from stasis on their trip to Mars or wherever, we know what the alarm clock will sound like, because it'll sound like an alarm clock. It'll be an electronic beeping sound, right? And it's like, well, there was a time when alarm clocks didn't sound like that. But design lock-in is thus that this all kind of flows through. And then I think the other one is kind of like MIDI being a sound file format that is designed by someone who played the piano. So it kind of follows that concept of music. Whereas if it had been designed by a violinist who have a more sort of fluid sense of where a note is and how it can be played, would the file structure be different and things like that, which is thought exercises. You start to kind of go, oh, that's really interesting. It feels with this that sort of quite interesting thought exercise of one, you know, relatively small thing that can have a massive consequence has just been multiplied by a factor of, you know, several thousand, if not hundreds of thousands, because it's like this is now baked into what we're using in a lot of different contexts, right? It's
absolutely. And, you know, it's not just us interacting with ChatGPT now, right? It's the downstream tasks that it's involved in. So the amount of things now that are plugged in the back end of ChatGPT and other LLMs as well, large language models. And it's those downstream tasks that people are using this for, you know, people are using them for chatbots, they're using them for decision making, for analysis, all kinds of things. And, you know, how do we know? Is that we don't always know if something's been, if a decision that impacts us has been decided upon by an AI or a large language model, remembering large language models aren't just the only AI. There's lots of different artificial intelligence. And, you know, there may be other things that are better, that suit the situation better.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, because you know, when you talk to people who are like, right, there's this new thing and we want to engage with it because it's here, and that sort of sense of hype, that sort of inevitability of it almost is kind of quite, you know, for most people who want to do something but don't know what, that idea of, I mean, we kind of talk of like the on-ramp to AI, but almost the the sorts of technologies that this stuff is based on, that you kind of got like, well, data science, and you've got the machine learning, and maths done really quickly is tantamount to kind of like magic, just because most people don't think about maths very quickly, and it does, and you're like, wow, how does it even do that? And as you go through, it's almost, you can see people, their eyes light up at going, oh, hang on, I've been using like fraud detection on my credit card for ages now, and that's something that, as you can't start stacking it up, you're on that on ramp to where we've ended up with this technology, and kind of just thinking about how it all fits together, and using the right tool for the right thing. Because there's a lot of stuff where you can see like generative AI is the answer, but perhaps that wasn't even the question that was asked in the first place. And what's the matchmaking, the tool selection process, I think, is one that kind of weighs heavy on people, even if before we even get into AI. So there's a lot of bits going on in that world too.
Remember that other AI models that we create are aren't susceptible to hallucinations, right? And they're called hallucinations for a reason, right? To anthropomorphize these LLMs. Hallucinations are just errors. If you had, and we talked about IT, if we go back 20 odd years, they were bugs in the system, right? We've been led to believe that this is acceptable and this is okay. Is it okay when it's affecting people's lives effectively? Is this okay that we have this technology that hallucinates, makes errors, and people are trusting it? People are using these chatbots as almost, as friends. People are developing bonds with these people. People have lost their lives because of these connections and the advice that they've been given by these chatbots. I'm just, it's problematic. Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, no, actually, that I think in a way as well, there's some, what you've just said there is often, I think we were saying just before the call that actually these are really good as an opportunity to kind of reflect on what you're doing and take that step back as to the day to day. And actually, when you look at that broad, because we're always thinking about it. Here's a use case, here's a business case, here's a very specific, and actually in doing so, what we're often doing is constraining the use of it down into a situation where you can make it as efficient as possible, and then think about what you need to do at the other end of it that quality assures the output, going, well, this is great, but it's just a tool, and it's a tool that's probabilistic in its nature. So you need to really look at what's going on, and this is the sense check you need to put on the back of it. But what we're also doing in that is kind of creating a slightly artificial sense of usage, because we are constraining as many of the variables to make it as efficient as possible. And in that case, it just made me think of the hallucinations piece is really interesting. And when people kind of say, oh, it's regularly hallucinating the same thing, I always find interesting, because that shouldn't really happen. And in a way, that's a very interesting statement when people are, oh, it's regularly hallucinating this. And actually often what it's done is you've uncovered a form of bias that's existing within it, where what it's regularly doing is saying what it knows to be true, but people are perceiving it as a hallucination because it's not what they expect it to say to be true. And actually, and that in a very constrained business or kind of like organizational setting, you can really call out and go, hang on, no, but that's there. But taking that step back, people are using this in so many different contexts now. It's kind of, what is it that people need to be prepared to think about when using this, to be prepared to use it appropriately, responsibly, safely, I guess would be the, in the widest context. So the things people could think about that kind of helps them understand what the bias of something is as they use it.
Sorry, that's felt like a statement rather than a question.
And then it was, I'm awful for that. So say you're sitting down and you're looking at something for the first time. So there's a new AI comes out tomorrow, and you're sat in front of it and you're about to kind of like use it. From your point of view, what do you do with it? What do you think about before, to kind of assess it and work out what it's all about?
I ask it basic questions. I ask it to almost autocomplete, like we do on our mobile phones. Yeah. So I just ask, I put in a phrase, like I said before, women can, men can, but I play around with that a bit and just ask it to complete my sentences. And I ask it basic questions because, quite honestly, these models are quite biased, and you'll be surprised at how easily they'll come out. And I think it's interesting that if you think about the people that that are using these systems, there are certain groups of people that will be using these systems, but who isn't using these systems is what I tend to think about. So if I look around, and I'll come back to a model that I put together, and I think this would be useful here. So if we think about obviously, so LLMs scrape the internet, right? Who do we know around us that actually uses the internet? Who do we know that posts on the internet? Just within our circle of people that we know, I would say 20% of the people that I know very rarely touch the internet because of their age demographic, or maybe they're working class, come from a working class background, something like that. People, some sections of society just don't post onto the internet. So I would interact with it as if I was one of those people from the first point. But so back to the model, which I think is interesting. So when I was doing my PhD, obviously there's a ton of stuff out there about. Obviously, I have to put together a literature review, need to think about everything that's happening. And there were themes that were being raised over and over again, which I found it useful with this model. So I call it discrimination drift, is what I call it. And I'm going to post it on to archive this week so people can see it if they want to.
Amazing.
So discrimination drift. So drift is an acronym. Almost like a SWOT analysis. So it's something that everybody across business pipeline can talk about throughout the business. So D stands for diverse teams. Make sure that you've got diverse teams. If people around you all look and sound like you, then you've got a problem. Representative data. Okay. And so is your data representative of society? Like I said, again, scraping the internet isn't good enough. Think about the global south. Is it representative of society? It is not. So we need to get data that's representative of society. So we've got I within drift, independent audit. Get somebody else to mark your own homework. It's important. You wouldn't do that with anything else that was being released into the world. Independent audit is important. Now, come to F in the framework, and I call that freedom, and that's for two things. So freedom to choose. So choose as a person in the public arena, choose to have your data used. Do I choose to have my data embedded within this model? There should be a process for us to be able to say, actually, no, I don't want my data to be used, and there isn't that at the minute. And also, freedom to challenge the status quo as well within an organization. So we've seen right across the industry at the minute, if people within these big tech companies at the minute raises their hand, if it's a big thing, they're going to get fired. If we haven't, I don't know if anyone came across the thing that happened to Timnit Gebru. If you haven't, please have a look at that. So that was awful within Google. She basically said that she wanted to publish a really important paper that highlighted the implications of transformer models, and they gave her an ultimatum, basically, either your job or don't publish or have a job. It's up to you. And she obviously published, and it's a really important paper. But that's happening over and over again. AI ethicists as soon as they raise their hand, there's a problem generally. And I've seen that across the industry. And the T part of the framework is transparency. We need transparency about how we're developing these models and about the data that we're using. Just being transparent. And what I say is, if we don't have these things, so the drift model you can have positive discrimination drift or negative discrimination drift, and that's going to impact on inequity. It's going to impact on power dynamics and social harms as well. So that paper's coming out, but that's how that's the summary of 6 years of looking at this, of how I've encapsulated it into a small usable thing that everyone can use.
That is brilliant. That is really cool. Thank you for sharing that. That's
all right.
I think that's really cool. Also, it's so I think within there, it's we again, you get a sense of that sort of diversity and kind of for in terms of design, we've diverse design is good design. And you get that in terms of usability for websites, for instance. We've known that if you can design something as diverse, for as diverse audience as possible, you probably design something that's super robust, that's super accessible, that anyone can use. Things, and things like that. You also kind of see, within business, more diverse boards. In terms of I think it was the FTSE 500, there was a piece of analysis done. The more diverse boards on average outperformed financially, like commercially, 30%, kind of were 30% more financially beneficial than other boards as well. And it's kind of, it's not just a good thing to do. It's like, it's a good thing to do in so many different ways. And it so often doesn't happen. And you kind of get that group think, and massive blunders can occur at best. But then sometimes it's just, that discrimination piece can kind of really creep in. And all of those kind of elements, they intuitively fit together. The idea of freedom and those two sets of kind of like it's almost like what as an individual kind of participating with your data into something collective, and also as an individual being able to comment effectively on this new thing. I think it's not one that's been quite articulated as clearly as that, but as soon as you say it, it's so incredibly important, because there's a sense of agency there that we're not, we're having it done to us, not with us, sort of thing. It feels that that is charging along at a rate of knots as well. That's brilliant. So where will that be published, and when will that be published?
So that I'm going to put it onto archive so I can share a link with you here, and we can disseminate it afterwards if that's okay. So archive, that will be a preprint.
Cool. Yeah. Oh well, this is very cool. I love this. We're just right on the cutting edge of stuff. That is fun. Okay, so with that model there, and kind of this work, reaching kind of completion or capstone of it, and a massive conversation at the moment about the role of regulation. I think there's something in there, just to put you on the spot massively, because I think we've kind of seen this sort of position where Europe's gone ahead with that big chunk of like horizontal regulation, like that sits atop everything and is there in lots of detail. And is that too much, or is it, constraining innovation? That's something that there's a lot of debate about. You've then also got in the States something that's close to sort of a patchwork of different sorts of things, voluntary codes, and whatever's there. And the UK has kind of gone, well, we want to pursue what we've done before, which is this idea of vertical regulation, where it's done. You've got those 5 principles at the top that are kind of thinking about, what you would want, but they're very top level principles, and each sector's being left to figure out regulation per each vertical and doing it that way. And that all seems to be happening at the moment. With that sort of as the lay of the land, if you were in charge of regulation tomorrow, what would you do? What we would be thinking about? Where is your head? And kind of really to give us fair, unbiased, but innovation friendly regulation.
So that's a big question, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it took the EU quite some time to put that one together. So So I align with the EU AI Act. I do personally. I think because it, that we're constantly trying to keep up with this innovation. So the key thing is to make sure that people aren't at risk, and they've taken a risk approach to this technology, which I think is important. I think the big tech companies will do their best to slow slow regulation down. But I do think that we need to step away. And are we there? Are we even there with social media? We briefly talked about this before we came on the call here. So so if we look at the impact that social media has had on the world, it's been huge, and it continues to have a huge impact on the world. And even now, with our data, if you have anything to do with Meta, if you have Facebook, your anything from I think last week is going to be scraped within Facebook. So I have a Facebook account. I don't remember getting any notification of that. So that's all very interesting, isn't it? I would approach it with a risk-based approach, just to make sure that. I mean, it's a hard question to answer. I'm put on the spot. I can't answer, but yeah.
That idea of risk-based sort of regulation, but also as a way of proceeding. I think that's really interesting. And when you see other areas that take a risk-based approach to kind of like regulation or compliance, so you've kind of got parallels with things like aviation, and a very strong risk-based approach. And it's something that I think when you think about it, that's something where there's very little appetite for things going wrong. Mm-hmm. But actually, so you absolutely have to take this idea, but also it's quite a mature attitude to risk. And I think that's been, there's a couple of themes that we've kind of seen with people who seem to be, as much as you can define doing it right at a time when God knows what doing it right means. But there's been a couple of themes. One of them has been that sort of the more mature an organization's attitude to risk is generally, the faster they've kind of gotten to grips with the applications of this sort of technology by really kind of going, this is where risk lies. And we know we can't eliminate it, but we can mitigate it. And also being quite clear on objectively or strategically how they want to use the tooling as well. So it's been very clear, this is what we want to do. This is how we can use it. This is how it works as far as we understand it. And here are all the risks that kind of start to crop up at that point. Now, can we work through? What's interesting is that you see, with this, there's a whole new set of like those unknown unknowns kind of just out there. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, hang on, what's going on there? It's not an easy question to answer. And it's social took, what was it, 10 years between first usage and kind of regulation coming out.
And are we there? I'm not sure we are.
Do you think there's that? Do you think the pace of this means that there needs to be something sooner? And the fact that it does the fact that it changes so frequently mean that it constantly needs to be revisited and it could all change overnight? I don't know. Why did I ask this question? It's a nightmare.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. So a couple of things. So a little while ago, I think a year or so ago, there was I was involved in an open letter to OpenAI. I think it was to OpenAI, and I think it was about a year ago. Might have been two. To actually ask for them to actually have a pause with this development. Yeah. And just have an actual pause while the world could catch up, while regulators could catch up. They didn't do that, right? But I think the key thing is accountability and who's accountable. And from my point of view, I think that the developers are accountable. I think the organization itself is accountable. I think those who are deploying it are accountable. And when it comes to regulation, I would ensure that that people know that they're accountable, and there are consequences if they don't do the right thing. And if it can cause harm to somebody, then there are repercussions, fines, whatever, depending, appropriate to the actual harm that was created. But again, that's a personal harm. But there's something bigger, that there's something other to think about. It's this social harm, isn't it? And the impact it's having on society as a whole. The internet's very polarized. I would argue that this, with social media, is going to cause even more polarization and problems within society.
Yeah, it is. It's that wider impact. It's kind of, yeah, it's also where, you know, kind of where does accountability lie in usage? That's a really good point. And it's, you know, you quite often see it's it's often the entity that's closest to the person who's been affected, where accountability kind of gets focused, but actually there's an underlying bedrock of things going on. It's the I was talking to someone the other day, and they made a very just thinking about parallels between where technology can go wrong and have a large consequence, is the post office scandal within the UK. And, you know, when you look at the impact of that on people's lives, it was absolutely atrocious, devastating for, you know, hundreds of people, for something that was a bug, as you say, in the IT. So, you know, fast forward 30 years, it could have been a hallucination in the AI. But what the question that was kind of posed back was, it's known as the post office scandal, not the Fujitsu scandal, even though they were the underlying suppliers of the technology. And that, as a, you know, that just kind of really made me think, yeah, and how close how we, you know, kind of it gets labeled, and then that becomes the thing. And actually accountability in that point, you know, how meaningfully can it be applied, and what is it that people, you know, what makes it right as well in that situation, you know, kind of, and who should be doing the, not just apologizing, but, you know, financial fines or things like that. It's not clearly articulated for something that's not even, you know, that sort of technology is decades old, and it's not been thought through. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. That was a ridiculous question. I need to. I will take accountability for answering too big a question. And yeah, and I don't even have the excuse of using AI for it. So I think what would be really, there's just so many big questions to ask, but as this gets embedded, and I think, you know, the genie is out the bottle, and, you know, it's there. It almost feels like there's too much time, effort, and money gone into it now to roll it back, to pause it. You know, the brakes have been snapped off the train, and off we go. And that, I think, can feel quite overwhelming. And, you know, what is it that I do to kind of participate in that? From your point of view, what should we be thinking about in that social sense? Even if it's just, you know, what should people be aware of or thinking about, or, you know, kind of doing in their day-to-day lives that can mitigate this in some way?
Well, you know, I've heard people, this is anecdotal, I can't never say that word, but I've heard, you know, people talking about they're heavily reliant on ChatGPT, not just in work, but outside of in there. Some people are asking it for personal advice, you know, and, you know, it's just not equipped for that at all. It's just a generation machine it's absolutely not equipped for that. So I think if you hear about people that are using it and really trusting it, just raise your hand and just say, look, you know, at the bottom of every prompt, it tells you that it could be wrong. You know, what other product tells you that? You know, they've done a brilliant job of selling this product. It is a great product, right? In some ways, it's a really good technology. But yeah, I would say I think the hallucinations are the key thing, and they're not ever going to be able to rid it of the hallucinations unless they plug something else into it, which will happen, I'm sure, over time. But at the moment, as the technology stands at the minute, you know, hallucinations are really problematic. So tell people about that. People are starting to forget that. They're using it almost like Google. So yeah, that's the one.
That is, yeah. I think you do forget that, and the amount of times it gets used for you know, kind of, I've heard people using it for kind of like medical advice, which is similar to that sort. You know, ask, you know, when doctors are like, oh well, someone's Googled it and it's this, and actually they've come in and it's something else entirely, and it's, you know, you kind of get that sort of piece. But then you hear about it for, you know, people using AI for that. We've also, you know, kind of looking around, looking at case studies for different sectors. You kind of read these quite weird and wonderful things. AI kind of like boyfriend girlfriend apps are out there as well, which is quite odd. Also, the fact that people are just kind of building up more of a personal relationship with technology because of the way it's presenting as this sort of more human, you know, anthropomorphized thing. The interesting example we got from some developers was that they were using, because there's a lot of kind of like AI can write, you know, generative AI can do code, and that's quite an interesting thing for a lot of people.
And it's great. Yeah, it's great at doing it, right? Well,
and also kind of like those apps where you can, you know, type in something and 5 minutes later have a fully functioning app. But then when you want to change bits, you just can't, because it's not, you know, you've not quite got the knowledge for it. It was being put together in a slightly strange way. But talking to a group of developers, and they were like, and it comes back to this sort of idea of, I don't know if it's a sort of bias, but it's definitely the information that it was trained on was based on a load of questions in like Stack Overflow or Reddit or things like that. And the people who were writing the questions and providing the answers were generally a certain level of developer.
Right.
So you weren't seeing kind of like some of these real god level devs or these really senior devs participating as much in the answers. And they certainly weren't writing many of the questions. So actually there's something in the way that it's doing code that means it's kind of tethered to this sort of concept of what a developer should know. But the definition of what a developer should know is based on lower level devs. And they're kind of starting to see this come through in sort of the niche that they're programming in. And again, it's kind of like that idea of you've got hallucination and you've got this sort of, there are hard limits to what it can do. And that idea of after a certain number of questions, it can just drop off a cliff in terms of its sense. And it just starts giving you really strange stuff as well, which again, you kind of think people are maybe aware of. I think that sort of cloud on the horizon, that there's a bit of a question mark. Kind of these things start to fit into it. But yeah, no, that's a really good piece of advice. I think also tying that into those who've been digitally excluded from previous iterations of technology, and actually now this thing is here, and kind of having the confidence to kind of question it as well, because for so long things have been presented as the computer says this and this is how it goes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Going back to your coding thing, though, I don't know if anyone saw in the press just last week that it's been revealed that when using ChatGPT for coding, it often, when you ask it to not to produce a system that will shut itself down, it circumnavigates that request over and over and over again. So you know it's there's stuff underneath the hood that's just, so even for coding, like I would use it for coding because I've spoken to some coders that just said I've not written a full line of code properly in a year or so because it's becoming so good. But like after that landed last week, I think people will rethink it a bit.
Yeah, it's vibe coding, isn't it? When you're kind
vibe,
of like,
yeah,
it's there's some stuff that came out from Anthropic about the biases that the machines kind of like how it was presenting, not bias like attitudes, and where it was trying to, and they broke it up into 5 themes, which my short-term memory is so broken I can't even get into, but it was kind of looking at like social bias, a personal bias, a protection of the individual bias, or kind of principles behind it that it seemed to be pushing its answers in certain directions. But that idea of it actually having that sort of ability is quite strange, and I don't think it's fully explainable.
No, and I just think someone's put a load of code, like it's just learned off a load of code that's just sitting there, right? In previous iterations of the GPT models, what you could do is you could type in, I've forgotten the Reddit handle of somebody, but you could actually type in the Reddit handle of somebody who was quite had strong opinions, really strong
Right.
opinions, and you would type that in, and it would just come back, and it would just tell you, it would tell you lots of stuff about this person's views. So that was interesting. But yeah,
That is,
but yeah,
yeah.
but we look at values, and all of the values that are embedded. Look at Grok. I mean,
Grok,
the white genocide stuff. That's bonkers.
Yeah, it's and I think this is the thing of that sort of level of bias being in, kind of like added as almost like an editorial line, like this is the case. That sort of rewriting of history and kind of what went on. I mean, in a way that the one sort of if that cloud had a silver lining, it was the fact that it was called out so quickly, which potentially, kind of makes you wonder what other things are kind of going on that haven't been called out. Yeah. And that idea of, kind of what's been going on. Gosh, so interesting. Another 4 things popped into my head, and we could get sidetracked. I've just realised the time as well. We have we were talking for like 5 minutes, and then it's an hour, which is bonkers. So that was really interesting, and thank you so much. And Drift, I think, will, as we kind of release this, we'll be sure to kind of track back into that, because it's just such a neat, elegant, and sort of simple way of thinking about what is a very complex situation. I have some quick fire questions, which are the opposite of that, really.
Right.
Which let me throw a few at you, and what we do with these is we just kind of put them out there to kind of get there. So I have them written down and everything, like a proper prepared professional, right?
Love the glasses.
I know. It's, if I don't, you'll just be 5 minutes of me desperately trying to remember different things. So let me just ask you a few things, and we've covered off quite a few of them. But in terms of staying up to date on this stuff, where do you go to get your kind of like your latest news or things that you find, resources you find useful?
Quite honestly, I do use LinkedIn heavily. So okay. And that might be just due to the network that I've developed over this time period of my PhD. So I'm connected to people who are heavily involved in this field. So for me, I stay on LinkedIn, and it tends to drop there before anywhere else, before anyone started publishing, before anyone's written any articles. People will just say, comment on something, and then it becomes something else. So yeah, LinkedIn's pretty good for that for me.
That's so interesting. We kind of hit upon this idea that you kind of have, as AI is emphasizing certain things. So strategy is one, like, because it's a powerful tool, powerful tactic, need powerful strategy. And then the other one is quality assurance, because it's like, it's probabilistic. So it could be doing that. You need to just assure that it's the right thing. And context is really important. And this idea of like, you've got data, but actually the context behind it, or you've got content, and what's the context behind it, that's very important. And then the last one was curation. And actually, in a world where there's just more and more stuff, the idea of the network, the tastemakers, the trusted voices needs to just come to the fore. And actually, that's something that AI, in terms of taking jobs or tasks or whatever, curation is fundamentally a very human piece, and actually quite random, and not, it's hard to come up with it instead of. So yeah, okay, that's really cool. And everyone's going to be following you on LinkedIn now just to see what you repost and talk on. So that's cool. We've actually, all of our quickfire questions we've gone through. This is I think, okay, interesting one is that what is it about the future of this stuff that excites you and makes you think this is something, tell me the utopia. What is the bit that you're like, right, this is cool?
So technology is powerful, right? And this technology has so much potential.
Yeah.
But its power, it's power that's really driving people's value systems that are driving the direction of this, and money that's driving this, the trajectory that we're on. What I would like to see is for it to be far more democratic, where you know everybody's included. We've got inclusive design. It's for the people. That you know, we're not just going to chuck something out there to make a quick buck and just see how it lands. You know, society isn't a lab for people, for rich people to play around with. You know, it's not really going to impact them, but it's going to really impact especially marginalized communities. And I think my utopia would be that everybody had a voice and everybody could be involved. And you know, when in the future, hopefully we can move towards that. And there are voices out there. There are people that are doing this good work, but they're fighting against, you know, a lot of power and money at the minute. So
yeah, cool. Well, I think that sums it up perfectly. So thank you very much for your time today and sharing that. Some really interesting stuff, and we'll we'll be sharing this across LinkedIn. So you know, people definitely can go out and find us all on LinkedIn, and we'll be putting it out there. And yeah, well, thank you very much.